Hey there. I just wanted to do a quick intro for this video. So I had a great chat with Mark Binkley and Hart, both really fascinating marketing people, and they have their own podcast as well. So we talk a lot about marketing and what we've learned throughout the years, and especially also about what we've learned from other podcast guests such as Mark Ritson and Byron Sharp and some of our other favorite lessons. And we also walk through this great visual called marketingland, where it's a breakthrough of the different most important aspects of marketing, and we take that as a sort of like loose framework to walk through and maybe even criticize a little bit and share what we learned about this really cool visual. So I think it's a really interesting chat about marketing and brand building and branding and how that all relates to each other from three different perspectives, and I think it's a great conversation, so I really hope you enjoy. And thanks Mark and Alan for having this chat.
Well, I'm super excited about joining two colleagues, officially colleagues from around the world. Steph, how do I say your last name? Is it Hammerlink?
Yeah, Hammerlink. It's perfect like that. Americans do tend to say Hammerlink. It sounds cooler, but it's Hammerlink.
Okay. And then Alan Hart. Welcome.
Thank you.
To our show.
Yeah.
This is so strange for me.
The Three Musketeers.
Exactly.
So we're all podcasters. We've all interviewed a bunch of people and in the marketing realm. And I'm really excited about this conversation today. It's an idea that we all had about, sharing ideas about things we've learned from interviewing other people. So before we get into that, just maybe Steph, start if you don't mind, just to kind of explain you and the podcast you have and why you started it.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's about 3-4 years ago. I don't remember. I started a podcast because I was mainly a brand designer, and I started doing a lot more brand strategy related stuff. And so I was looking for information on how to do more of that and get a bigger scope of what a brand is about and how to build one. And so I started this podcast, and it started with interviewing brand strategists from around the world. And then it grew into marketing scientists and all kinds of practitioners and authors and like a whole bunch of people. And I slowly, gradually realized like the essence of the podcast was a little bit about like trying to debunk a lot of the branding fluff that's out there. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where I like felt very comfortable at, because there's a lot of BS in branding. Yeah. And so also interesting to see how I gradually overlapped with marketing more and more, because I started talking to people like Byron Sharp and stuff like that. But we'll get into that, I think, in maybe that overlap and what the differences are later, because I may be the strange one here from the bunch in the sense that I'm a little bit more on the branding, brand strategy side, but I talk a lot about marketing as well.
Awesome. And Alan, how about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been doing marketing consulting or marketing my entire career. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I was leading a consultancy, and we needed two things, basically. Needed to expand our network. And so interviewing people was one way to do that. And then the other piece is I had been doing some thought leadership around CMOs for a number of years, and many of them just wanted to abandon the use of the marketing title, which scared me as a marketer. And I said, why is that? Everyone wants to call themselves a business executive, not a marketing executive. And I felt like better knowledge, better highlights from marketing would maybe help. So in a small way, I was hoping I might save the use of the marketing word by executive by doing these interviews.
Yeah.
You wanted to get the dirty taste out of the mouth.
Yeah, exactly. And for better or worse, I don't think that the trade presses do a great job of covering marketing. They do a great job covering advertising, but maybe not marketing.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, fair enough.
what about you, Mark?
For myself, I mean, this started as I had done a podcast maybe 10 years ago, way back when I had this idea of like the Goodwill Hunting thing where I figured I could do my own MBA for the price of, late fees and a couple of book rentals from the library. So one of the tools that I had used to, I scoured all these different MBA programs and looked at their curriculum and built my own more marketing branding based thing. And one of the things I did to learn was really around podcasting experts in the field to try and understand, more about business and more about how systems work and brand strategy. Ultimately, what I was trying to do is draw branding, which turned out to be a monumentally challenging task. And I'm not a very good drawer. So anyway, I really enjoyed that experience. And then, fast forward a few years, and we're looking for our organization, looking at producing content, positioning ourselves as thought leaders in the space. Mm-hmm. Again, for me, wanting to find people with really good answers. Steph, to your point, there's so much bullshit out there. And I was just like getting lost in all these different ideas and theories and models and processes and not really knowing what worked. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of my quest for this series of podcasts, is to be able to answer what does work. And then also, all those other things I talked about.
Who's your favorite, guest on the show?
For me?
Yeah.
Oh, that's like, what's that movie? Pritzi's Choice or whatever, Sophie's Choice. It's like each person I've interviewed is so fascinating for so many different reasons. I'd say I've really been fortunate that I've gotten to interview a number of people. Like you talked about Byron Sharp. I interviewed Jenny Romanek, Mark Ritson. Those are probably the most famous names. But I mean, it's really hard to say. There's a couple of ladies I interviewed who run an AI company. Mm. For the most part, nobody would have heard of them. But it's fascinating hearing what people are working in and what they're doing and how the kinds of projects that they're trying to tackle and the solutions they're trying to solve for.
Yeah. I hate that question actually, because it's like trying to pick.
I'm sorry, I asked
it's trying to pick your favorite kid. Luckily I only have one daughter, so she's always my favorite. But we share a number of interviews. I think the same. Like Mark Ritson, I always love talking to because he's just hilarious.
I haven't gotten to him. I tried reaching out and we said we're going to do it, but it didn't work out yet. So, but I mean, I've heard him on so many podcasts, and at a certain point you wonder whether you need to do another Mark Ritson conversation.
That's true.
But man, I do love his takes on marketing and I agree. Sharp was definitely a turning point for me, not per se the podcast interview as such, but just discovering the whole Ehrenberg Bass Institute. That was a big turning point for me, because I was a more traditional branding person, obsessed with differentiation and stuff like that. And once I started talking to people like him and Weber Schneiders and Jenny and a lot of people, I discovered a whole new world, a brave new world out there. And it's interesting to see how those two can come together.
Well, along that lines, Steph, and now we're for full transparency, we're stealing all of your questions you always ask your guests, and so I'm going to try but I'll probably butcher the way you've laid them out. But I think there's such a great structure in that. So what you were just talking about, Steph, made me think about one of Alan's questions, which is what topic do you guys think we as marketers need to be learning more about?
That's an interesting question. I'd probably say, and this is gonna sound weird, but I think what I see as a big problem is people in marketing are really good at the research, segmentation, positioning stuff, maybe also more the comms, the tactics, all of that. what very often is missing there is a little bit the part where it's more about branding. And I do mean probably visual identity design, but also sonic, all of that stuff. Because of obviously it's a different discipline. And I would say the same for branding people. They're lacking the other side. And I know you can't be all of that, but I think there should be more like conversation and overlap between those two, because if you go to a marketing agency, you'll get a completely different vibe than a branding agency and completely different conversations. And I don't think that's a good point to be at.
How about you, Alan?
I mean, for me, I think it's less about learning something new and maybe just making sure we reinforce the basics, whether that's, how brands grow from Byron Sharp, or just the basic 4P model, of pricing, positioning, promotion, and placement. And I feel like many times we get too far outside of that, and it starts to fall apart fairly quickly. I'm doing some research. There'll be a forthcoming podcast episode with a company called Attest. And we asked one simple question at the beginning of the survey for everyone that's taken it. What made you choose the last brand that you purchased? And, 54%, I think something like that, was price. And then, the thing that is constantly in the news right now around purpose, it was 8% or just slightly less than 8%. And so if I think about that, I'm like, we still have to get the fundamentals right before we can do anything more than that. And so I would maybe double down on the fundamentals, if you will.
Yeah, for me, I think we're all kind of saying the same thing. Just to build off what you guys are saying, because the fundamentals part is really key, and like what you're saying, Steph, about the brand identity aspect and the visual community and sonic, and all the sort of distinctive asset stuff that Jenny talks about, and in that sort of discipline, I think is critical. And we often are afraid of doing that. Like, it's almost like, I remember we were working, one of my old jobs, I was working with it was in retail, a sporting goods store, and one of the consultants we had worked with at one point was like, it's almost like you guys are ashamed of being yourself. It's like, what are you doing? He's like, nobody knows you from Nike, from Adidas, he's like, you should be yourself. Like, make sure people know. So I think that's really critical. And going, to still build off of what Alan said too, like the 4 Ps is so critical. And I think one of the things that marketers get labeled as is, actually, we're saying marketers, but most often we're advertisers. And I think marketing, when you think about, marketing is everyone's job and those kinds of things, it is about the 4 Ps. And we were chatting earlier about that marketingland diagram. And for me, that was like a revelation. I took Ritson's course, and one of his courses anyway. It was amazing. But like understanding the discipline of marketing, how you can skip just to tactics, but unless you do the stuff at the beginning, like market orientation, market research, segmentation, building out a proper segmentation map, then you kind of, like, whatever you're going to say you do in the targeting and positioning probably isn't going to work nearly as well as had you started from the beginning. So I feel like that's a really valuable thing to think about.
Yeah, I agree hard on all things mentioned, and I think what Alan said about the 4 Ps, it's really interesting for me because I came from like a different industry, and when we were talking to marketing people, quote unquote, most of what I heard was like, we're SEO, SEA, social media, campaigns, whatever. So at a certain point, like, you start to really just associate marketing people with that part of marketing, which is just a small part even of the promotional P. And like when I started reading more and people like Ritson started sketching that broader understanding, I was thinking like, who's actually doing all of this stuff we're seeing here in the graph. And I guess it's like it moved, or it's everyone in the organization, but it's probably like so much equated now to business strategy in a way. That's really interesting for me to see, but it is marketing at the end of the day.
I wonder, Alan, if that is maybe like this diagram, thinking about this, maybe part of the reason why people wanted to get away from the CMO title, because it's too linear in the advertising sort of vertical.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it may be. I mean, I think a couple of things I think were going on at that point in time. B2B marketers in particular were jettisoned the marketing function. And I think just historically in the B2B space, they've been known as the marcoms folks, you know, and it's more about the promotion or the communications piece. And so they wanted to swim back up to strategy, right? How do we talk about the product? How is the product designed? What is the product supposed to, what market is it trying to serve, et cetera? On the consumer side, I think there's always been, maybe it's been a little bit more focused on marketing and less about business, but it still depends on the industry, I think. But I agree. I think the CMO in many organizations now has a much more latitude to be a true player at the C-suite. With their peers and bring kind of a business strategy or business perspective to the table, as well as marketing. And I'm glad to see that, because it wasn't always that case. CMOs sometimes reported to a president of a division or a COO in some cases when I started this process. So it's nice to see them with their own seat at the table.
Yeah. Like maybe one take I want to share, it's more of like almost an open question or an observation towards you, is like what I've been seeing as a brand strategist is that very often what I'm doing is partly going through this, like what we see here, diagnosing, understanding the market, making sure we position the brand properly. And that is then labeled as we're doing brand strategy, or we're defining the brand strategy. And then afterwards, we start talking to the marketing people, which is kind of interesting. And I know this is semantics and stuff, but it's also how it lives in organizations in a way. And it's interesting to me how I see, like, in a way, brand strategy is like this new layer being built on top, while it's in reality not. It's just marketing strategy. But and then what's really interesting about that is that you see here in this graph, like at the end, there's the brand beach, where it's all fun and chill to hang out. But in a way, brand strategy is also like leveling a little bit on that on top. I don't know if you've experienced similar things. I've seen similar. This is really just my like limited view on what's happening.
Yeah, I'll jump in if you don't mind, Alan. Like I just recently was reading a couple of things on LinkedIn. One was from Roger Martin, who I think is amazing.
Yeah, he's a great guy. Yeah.
Oh my God, he's so smart. And then there was another post from another, I can't remember the guy's name. I think he was a professor somewhere. The professor's argument was brand strategy or marketing strategy is not the same thing as business strategy. And then, I may be butchering this, but Roger Martin's version is, doesn't fucking matter who does it. Somebody needs to do it. And I'm paraphrasing him, obviously. My words, not his. Yeah. But ultimately, I think Roger Martin's take is like, it can be marketing. And if his take, I think, is that if you're properly trained on how to do this stuff, then it really doesn't matter who's doing it, right, so long as it gets done. And I think that's why maybe, Steph, that you've seen that some of this brand strategy work that you're doing sits above the marketing department, because you do have to have all different stakeholders involved in that. And it's not just, the way you position a product or a company in an ad. It has to be everything that the company does.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. I agree with your paraphrasing of Roger Martin. You know, it doesn't matter who does it as long as somebody does. I mean, I think the sad thing is there's a lot of businesses where it just never gets done. You know, and you know, we find brands start to decay, and that's just a really sad thing. The interplay between brand strategy, business strategy, and marketing strategy is very, very murky, right? Like, and it's very confusing to a lot of people. At its simplest core, I always think about business strategy as like the strategic choices of which markets are we going to be in versus other markets. So, I always think about that in terms of like, you know, an outcome is like mergers and acquisitions. Do I need to go buy something, merge with somebody, or it could be new product development, like innovation. Like we're going to go organically build this ourselves. And then I think a marketing strategy is like, okay, how do we attack that market, right? Like, so now we're going to the market level and deciding how are we going to play in that market? Who are we going to serve? All those types of decisions. And then I think about brand. Brand is probably the hardest one to fit into a linear model, because to your point, Steph, earlier, and Mark, your point, it needs to leverage the business strategy and the marketing strategy. And it means you have a lot more stakeholders to bring to the table in that regard. Because at some element, unless you're P&G, you know, Procter and Gamble, and you've got like a house of brands where each brand can have its own special brand strategy. Most of the time, the brand is the company, and vice versa. And so it mirrors the company strategy more than it does a specific product.
Yeah, and I guess
mirrors
like
the company strategy more than
part
it
of
does
the issue with brand strategy is that like everything is brand, so everything is kind of brand strategy in a way. But that's also like, you could look at this graph and say, well, yeah, that's all brand strategy. But I get why it's like brand reaches at the end, because it's like it's the output of all these things, and it's what gets in touch with consumers, and where there's a lot of things happening. Maybe there could be like some like gondolas and subways going back up and there, up and down to illustrate that it's not like a one-way stream going down, but it's actually more of like communicating vessels. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. In terms of, actually, I don't know. I know there's a little logo at the bottom. I actually never read it to see who designed that graph, but it's. I think they did a pretty good job at like trying to articulate a really complex idea in an easy way.
Yeah,
the proper marketing club.
There you go. That's a great name.
Sounds very British. The proper marketing club. We don't have any Brits at the table, so we can laugh.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like the Chartered Marketing Institute. Yeah. Yes.
So for you guys, thinking back to some of the podcasts, some of your favorite podcasts you've ever done, your favorite guests, or the ones you learn most from, like, which ones do you think of that or come to mind, either looking at this chart or diagram that we've got here, or even just, you know, based on some of the conversations that we had?
Yeah, I had this before. I had this thought, it slipped away, but now it's back. So I had a conversation with Faisal Siddiqui last week, actually. So it's quite top of mind. And he mentioned this really interesting fact about marketing. Let me just try and get it right in words, so I don't mess it up quickly. Let me pass it on to Alan or somebody else. I'm gonna find it because it was a really good quote.
Who is I don't know Faisal.
Faisal is like, he's the founder of the Creative Business Company.
Okay.
They're not well known, but they're from Toronto, and he recently released a white paper on like how to build big brands on a small budget.
Okay.
It was a really interesting conversation. I'll go grab that quote quickly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, while you're looking for that quote, I mean, some of my favorites have been, and Mark Ritson talking about diagnosis of a brand, and how he approaches that. It was fascinating. I love talking to a guy named Bob Hoffman.
I've listened to a couple of years with him.
Yeah,
really great. He's really good.
He's like the voice of truth, right? Like he comes from the ad agency industry, but doesn't believe all the hype and the BS that come out of that industry. And at the end of the day, it's like no one would care if your brand disappeared tomorrow, right? Like we would just go on to the next thing as people do, and so it's nice and grounding, if you will. Every conversation I have with him. And I don't know. I mean, there's been so many that every guest that comes on, I learned something from. I think some of the more interesting stuff recently would be there's definitely a lot of push towards what I call branded entertainment, which is kind of interesting to me as a potential new promotion channel. And I think it's one that is going to be hard to do right, frankly. But if you can do it, brands that stand out in that space, like a Red Bull, or even in the B2B space, there are some. I think Salesforce is actually doing a fairly decent job of this as well, sponsoring podcasts and other entertainment / edutainment venues. I think it's a pretty interesting extension of marketing into a new space.
Yeah, I did a podcast with. Sorry, go ahead. Steph.
Sorry, I found a quote. I just gonna drop it in here, and then I'll let you have it. So Faisal said something along so he says, like, in a regular business, there's no one taking the time or a few weeks out to look at consumer or the market and all that stuff and really take a deep dive into this whole contextual space around the brand. And then he says something like along the lines of, so you're going to do all of that, like see all of that potential to write a fucking comms brief. And it was like, I really liked it because it's like, it opens up the idea, like there's potential for us to influence business decisions and brand and marketing and all of those. And I think that was like a really good thing to say, because there's not a lot of people looking at it from this far at the island. So sorry, go ahead.
So two thoughts, one on branded entertainment, and then one on that quote you just had. So on the branded entertainment side, I interviewed a woman by the name of Karen Whitney Vernon, who works for a company in Canada that does branded entertainment. It was really fascinating listening to some of the examples they have, and projects they've worked on, because it and especially in the context of like the 50-50, like, or 60-40 rule, right? Investing in brand, investing in tactical. The brand stuff, if you dig into that and you believe that it's about influencing customers tomorrow who don't care that much about you and aren't going to respond to buy now messaging, because advertising is a weak force, not a strong force. And if the goal for those people who are not in market today is just to get them to remember you at all in specific buying situations, then brand entertainment is actually a really interesting opportunity. But is hard sell, I think. Because it doesn't have the ROI that you would normally tie to, or want, or expected to tie to things. Agree.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely right now. It's kind of a luxury of big brands, I think. Because it's easy to carve off a little sliver.
I remember like an interview with I think was the Casper founder, like the mattress brand. And he said, like, at a certain point, they wanted to build this media company around sleep. I mean, sounds smart, but he said, like, we did podcasts and videos and a whole bunch of stuff. And after, I think, a year or two, they had to cut the whole thing down because it wasn't getting them the things they wanted. I guess it has to really be ingrained in the business in a way, like Red Bull, how they own these sports and also create a lot of media. I think it works well for them, but it's definitely not a one way solution for a lot of things. It costs a lot of money you could be spending elsewhere, I guess.
For sure.
No, agreed.
And the other thought I had about what you're just saying, Steph, on the quote from that guy is like, instead of writing just a comms brief, like the choice, and you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, and I always think about Roger Martin's cascade and like the nested cascade in Playing to Win, but like the choices that you make in this, like once you get to the market segmentation, then you have this idea of like where the business can go, which segments the business can go to serve with product, services, whatever the case may be. And you have to choose those ones carefully, because that means later down the line, it's not just about an ad. It's about like, what is the right price for the products we're developing for that specific segment and not that one. And how do we distribute it to those people? And then how do we then promote? Like, so the promotion part, I think is at the very end, because it's like lipstick on a pig. Otherwise, you can't change the pig. It's still a pig if what you have is a pig, but you don't have to have a pig if you do the market segmentation and market orientation stuff right at the beginning.
So true.
Yeah.
I think that's smart, and maybe it might lead to the conclusion that like a good comms brief can in a way be like the crystallization of all the other stuff that goes above it. But I guess it's more about where the decisions are being made and your role within that. And I think there's definitely more opportunity, but it really depends on the engagement. I mean, my aunt and I know some other people who work in advertising, the whole model of like pitching a campaign based on some basic research and presenting a bold idea. I think it's like, it's so counterintuitive for me, because there's no way to dig into what's happened before and what has worked and like doing some strategy work basically. So I find it always like really weird in a way. This is like a different world for me, and I don't know if I could handle it to do strategy in that way.
Yeah. For me, some of the things that I was thinking about when we're talking about some of the podcasts that we've learned most from, there's sort of three that are related that I'll just talk about real quick. So there's a guy named Chris Nealon I interviewed who's really passionate about cult brands. I mean, his company's called Cult Collective. Talks a lot about loyalty, and so we have disagreements there on that.
Yeah.
But what I like about the conversation there is that I had with him is that it was a really challenging conversation, because we didn't always agree on the topic, and so trying to articulate what it was that I didn't agree with, or seeing a different point of view, I thought was so interesting, because it forced me to rethink all the things that I thought I knew. So it was interesting from that side of things. And so for all the conversations I've had with people, like that's one of the things I've loved, is just hearing the different opinions. The other one is on, talking about, are we all we going to do is build out a brand brief, or, the CMO, the right title, or, how do we get strategy from it just being marketing to more business and stuff. There's two guys that I'd spoken to at different times. One is named Eddie Obeng, another guy's named Manoj Jasra. And so the two of those, what I liked about that are as a linked idea is Eddie talked about there's a difference between change and transformation. He talked about the idea of a caterpillar and how a caterpillar can get fatter, and that's change. But transformation is a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. And that's terrifying for a lot of people to talk about, because it's not, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen when you go in this cocoon. But the whole analogy of that I thought was really interesting. And then along that lines, Manoj talked about the idea of momentum being really important. And so I think so often we see things like, what's the ROAS on this? Like, what's the return we're getting? What, like now. And some of those things are like, those are important for sure. But if we're talking about long-term brand building and all the things that go into that, I really like the idea of prioritizing momentum as well, because there's just so many things that need to align and change, and you get buy-in from different people. And so what comes out at the end of this 3-year, commitment that you're making to, increasing market penetration and market share and all those kinds of things, is a journey. And I really like that idea, but about not knowing what's going to happen necessarily, but committing to it and just accepting momentum is a good thing.
Right.
Love that.
Change is hard, right? Like, and transformation even harder. And I'm trying to find a podcast guest that I had on, Canadian. There's a lot of good stuff going on in
Probably
Canada,
really
Mark.
good.
Yeah, I know. But
syrup.
yeah, exactly. But I mean, he talked in particular a lot about change, and give me a minute and I'll find him. Oh, Joe Jackman.
Yeah.
So Joe Jackman, I think he's out of Toronto or outside of Toronto. But we talked quite a bit about change and transformation. I think his company is even like the innovation agency or something like that. So it's, and helping companies to your point, evolve themselves. Usually it's large companies that have kind of lost their way or are being disrupted in some form or fashion. But it's really tackling the human component to allow for that change to happen, which I thought was pretty insightful.
Yeah. There's two like interesting things that I'd love to like put on top of this. Like one of them, I think, is what I've been learning a lot about lately is from JP Castlin. He's talking a lot about emergence and emergent strategy. And it's like an interesting little field when you're talking about momentum and so on, is this idea of you have to let go a little bit of the idea that your strategy is gonna work out as planned, and you have to let other inputs dictate what's going to happen. And like this idea of we're living in a complex world and markets are complex and you can't really decide it all. I think it's an interesting thought on a pragmatic level. I think you still need that strategy to have some direction and go somewhere. But I think the thinking that comes out of people like JP Castlin can be interesting to have and just to open up a little bit of that rigorous, like traditional planning methodology and like be open for new things. And then another thing I love to talk about when we're talking about marketing is I really enjoy everything Paul Feldwick has been doing. And I know it's quite advertising focused, but his take on branding is really like, he brings it back.
The Peddler Sings, right?
Yeah.
I listened to that one you did with him. That was great.
Yeah. It's the way he like talks about branding is like he pulls it back into history to when people went out in markets and they sold like snake oil stuff. Like that's the origin of marketing. It's like you go stand in a square and you start shouting very interesting things, maybe do a little bit of a show, like a circus around it, and then you get people to buy that. And that's the idea really of entertainment. And he's like really like he really makes this point that marketers has become, maybe it's more advertisers though, but we've become so afraid to just be entertaining and fun and build fame. And those are like the real basics of brand building in a way. And I really love his like very like turning it all upside down and looking at the origins of advertising, not as these smart like Ogilvy types of people who wrote really smart and savvy stuff, but like the kind of sleazy people selling or the peddler going door to door. That's like the real origin of marketing. I kind of like that. Like it makes it simple again.
I think I saw it. If you look up the oldest ads in the world, one of them, it's like this image that you can find on a carving on marble slab that was on the ground in some path, and it was like a footprint pointing one direction, and then a carving of a woman's head, which was like, "Go this way for the whorehouse." I was like, oh, that's like, it is maybe the oldest profession. Like,
Yeah,
very straightforward.
very, very true. I mean, not to go to both extremes, but I always think about like the oldest forms of marketing is really religion, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you think about branding and symbology and building community around a brand, I mean, almost every religion in the world kind of falls into that category. Yeah, so I guess we've now covered prostitution and religion all within the podcast.
Wow. And that also covers purpose, so we can get on.
Yes. check. The new 3 Ps. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
As far as the largest opportunity or threats, then maybe this is a threat. But how do you guys think about big opportunities or big threats?
Alan,
yeah, I mean, for me, there's two pieces to this, and they're both opportunities and threats. But one is like the how we organize ourselves as teams, and many of the like barriers we've been talking about through this conversation of like, is that brand strategy or is that business strategy? Is that marketing strategy? Like the barriers that we've built is in part an opportunity to fix that, like break those down, create more, whether you want to say like teams of self-controlled, self-decision-making groups that can skirt across disciplines, I think is a huge opportunity within marketing to try to get that right and bring speed to the equation as well, to respond to customer needs, etc. So that's one. Right, so how we organize ourselves. The other one that scares me a little bit is the just continued like industrialization or consolidation of channels, whether it's Facebook or Meta, I can't get used to calling it Meta, Google, but they control so much of the ecosystem of marketing that it's a little scary to me. Now, that may get disrupted if we're successful with like the next generation of the web, like, or new entrants come to the market, I hope. But they just feel so codified right now. It's a little scary if you're a marketer.
Love that.
Yeah, those are good.
I have one fear. It's like I'm gonna sound old, although I'm not that old actually. But like I feel like a lot of, and this has been said a lot of times in branding, and probably it's an old song, but I think like there's a lot of fear of showing character and like being a little bit weird or funny or different, and I mean that mostly visual. Like I do see the whole trend of brands having this aesthetic that's very similar and it's very typography driven, and I love that, but in a way it makes it really hard to stand out. And like it probably has to do with the way we just design things in digital tools. And I'd love to see some more quirkiness and weirdness and maybe even like some pixelated funky stuff going on. I don't know what it is, but it's just I feel like it's really like even the legacy, the iconic brands, they look really well rebranded. Like Burger King did a rebrand lately, and it's really cool, but in a way it's all becoming like more similar. So that's something I see both as fear and as opportunity. There's an opportunity to create more like mascots and funny things and crazy stuff, and like what Paul Feldwick says, like make brands entertaining. So I think that's a little bit of both.
I like that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
There's a great visual on the internet of luxury brands that have rebranded to your very point. They all look the same when it's all said and done.
The blanding.
Yes, the blanding. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Mark,
good.
any points? Any closing thoughts? Because we're almost
Yeah,
there.
I mean, for me, I would say kind of like what you were talking about, Alan, and Steph. Like I think strengths and weaknesses are often, it's a double-edged sword, or it's flip sides of the same coin. And from that perspective, I think the biggest opportunity and threat is us, like marketers, or advertiser, however we kind of call ourselves. And with that, like I love like the myth busting stuff that we started talking about, and I think we all kind of had a similar purpose, if you want to call it that, to figure out what's working and what is working and why does it work, and being able to explain that. And so just blindly following things that people say, like when I first started in radio and TV, as a sales guy, everyone was like, well, we got to build everything off of 3 frequency. And there's no truth in that. Like, that's not real, but that's just what everybody says. Or things like it's cheaper to make than keep a customer, or cheaper to keep than make a customer. And there's zero fact in that. There's all these things like SWOTs and Maslow. Ritson's got also an amazing top 10 list, and he goes off about some people specifically. But yeah, like it's chasing these trends like TikTok or NFTs and all that kind of stuff it's not the solution. Those are a means to an end, but they're not the solution. I think we need to prove that things are working. And I going back to that diagram at the beginning, I think it's a really good thing. Like, you don't start at the end at just promotion. You have to start at a higher level. So for me, that's the opportunity and threat.
Awesome. Well, thanks for doing this, guys. This was a fun chat.
Yeah, I loved it. And as I said, like, I love having more conversations with people from different like disciplines, all related to the same thing. So I think this is one of those cool things to do. Thanks a lot for chatting.
That was great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.